So I graduated from college with a degree in math just about 40 years ago. And it was, for those of you who are old enough to remember, that was kind of the peak of a big recession. Interest rates were double digit, and the unemployment rate was really high, and especially for kids like me who were coming out of state schools. There were really two jobs available. You could go into, retail sales or sales of some sort, or for a few people like me, I was a math major. You could get a job as an actuary or a computer science person. Now, just to kind of give you an idea, back then, computer science was part of the math department. It didn't even have its own, because there were little cards, and it was I didn't see any futures in computers, so I went to become an actuary, and it's really interesting. As I was graduating from college, I took the personality test. How many of you have taken a personality test of some sort, right? And the personality test basically said, don't be an actuary, don't be a computer programmer, high on my list were things like advertising and marketing, but being a relatively shy, not so confident person at that point, going into sales just seemed like, it's too far. I mean, it just didn't seem like that was going to be my personality. So, and they weren't hiring for the jobs that I thought would really be fun. And so I decided to go into being an actuary at a company in St. Paul called Securian now. It was Minnesota Mutual at the time. And I was put into what was basically known by everybody outside of the department as the anti-sales department. We were the people who did the financial underwriting to make decisions about whether, when a salesperson finally got to the point of making a sale, it would come to us and we would have to decide whether it was a financially good deal or not. I can tell you that there would be a lot of people that I used to work with that would be rolling their eyes to see me associated with talking about the vocation of sales and the idea of it being a godly calling. But from that time until today, I have actually seen what an honorable profession it is. And as soon as you move up into the ranks of any kind of organization, you inevitably become part of the sales process, and you become in the sales system. And it's a really important part of every part of commerce. As Rick was saying, that's a part of what he does here as we talk about advancement is part of that role of how do we get the message out, how do we talk about what we do. So I want to start with here's my agenda so you can get a sense of what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about calling and vocation at a pretty broad level, because I think it's important for us to get grounding on some definitions and what is calling and vocation, et cetera. And then we're going to talk about sales specifically, and can a sales role be a godly calling? I think that's a legitimate question, and we'll talk a little about that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, do we even need salespeople anymore? Isn't Amazon just going to take over the world, and the 5-star ratings will just make everything super easy and we can be done with that? Let's then move to the changing role of sales and how that plays, and then move even deeper into some data. And we have available afterwards a case study that we did that looks at data and what kind of sales, what's the secret sauce for great sales. And interestingly enough, you'll hear that as being really connected to what it means to be a godly salesperson. And then we're gonna end to some degree with the challenges of sales, because sales is a role where conflicts of interest, good, bad, or indifferent, just come to the surface. And so how do we manage those conflicts? So as Rick said in my introduction, I grew up in the Lutheran tribe of Christians, and as I'm sure you're aware, Martin Luther was, a key figure in the Reformation that we just celebrated the 500th anniversary of, and he's often thought of with the kind of the theology of justification, grace alone, and our relationship with God. But if you really study that part of the history of the Reformation, it was as much about vocation and commerce and stewardship as it was about justification. And oftentimes, as that co-equal part gets lost in some of our thought of how we think about the Reformation. And in fact, the organization that I was CEO of, Thrivent, which is just down the street, is a product that came right out of the Reformation. The theology of new ideas of stewardship. There was a social upheaval, and in fact, they had to rewrite a whole bunch of the contracts of how to take care of the poor, and how do you think about stewardship, and how do you think about the role of the church in taking care of the poor. And in fact, they went back to Acts 2 and 4 and tried to model a system. And in fact, if you've played the game Monopoly, there's a little card that you get that's called the community chest. That comes right out of the Reformation, and it was actually the fraternal agreement of the common chest of the entire assembly of Leipzig, 1523. And interestingly enough, this is a key for the Wittenberg community chest. So they would actually give out these big keys just like this, and one was given to the church, the leader of the church, one was given to the mayor, one was given to basically the business people, and one was given to the common person, and they'd have to agree on rules for taking care of each other. And when you read the document, what you hear about is things like microfinancing and micro loans and grants, and all the things that we think are so modern were actually things that Christians have been wrestling with, frankly, for all of time, whether it was in Acts 2 and 4 or in 1523. But out of that, there were a whole bunch of quotes on vocation. I mean, there was a lot of written about vocation and calling and how that worked at about that time. And what I really loved about this was I read a whole bunch of quotes that you'd get to the end and you try to figure out who really, they were almost all attributed to Martin Luther, and he almost said none of them. I'll give you one of them. This is like a famous Luther quote that he never actually said. But it's about vocation, and it's become really popular for some reason, but it says, this is the quote: "The maid who sweeps the kitchen is doing the will of God just as much as the monk who prays, not because she's singing a Christian hymn as she sweeps, but because God loves clean floors. The Christian shoemaker does his Christian duty not by putting little crosses on the shoe, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship." A great quote about, honestly, the Puritan work ethic and Protestant work ethic, but it's not really vocation in the way that I want to talk about it. And so I want to give you a quote that actually was a Luther quote, and I want to see if you can see the difference, because I think getting the idea of vocation right is part of the way to start with this. So this is an actual quote. It's really close, but it's not the same. See if you can pick up the difference. "The prince should think, Christ has served me and made everything to follow him. Therefore, I should serve my neighbor, protect him, and everything that belongs to him. That's why God's given me this office, and I have it that I might serve my neighbor. That would be a good prince and a ruler. When a prince sees his neighbor oppressed, he should think, that concerns me. I must protect and shield my neighbor. The same is true of a shoemaker, a tailor, a scribe, or a reader. If he or she is a Christian tailor, he should say, I make these clothes because God has bidden me to do so I can earn a living and so I can help and serve my neighbor. When a Christian does not serve the other, God is not present." So kind of get the difference between those two. It's one of vocation is being whatever you're doing, do it to serve the Lord, versus you got to get a clean floor and a production. And kind of wrongly understood, what we do is we become enslaved to the boss because we got to have clean floors. In another way, you think of it as a vocation is anything I'm doing, as long as I'm doing it in a way that I can serve my neighbor, it's a calling. And I think that's a really important, subtle point of vocation and calling is that it really doesn't matter what we're doing as long as we're serving our neighbor. But then I want to add another little wrinkle. So last summer, we went on a retreat, and we were reading a book as a week-long hiking and spiritual retreat, and it's called Living Life Backwards. And it's by a pastor from Aberdeen, Scotland, and it's basically a commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes. And I just want to give you the idea of how it starts. So he's a pastor, and basically each chapter was a part of Ecclesiastes, and then he would start by writing a one-phrase idea at the top, and then an application. And so the very first chapter, which was to be a summary of basically the whole chapter of Ecclesiastes that he was going to do the commentary on. So the first chapter, it was his own quote: "Preach the gospel, die, be forgotten." Then he had his name. And he basically said, the reality is all of our vocations, all of our callings will come to that. And until you can actually wrestle with that thought, it's really hard to live in the joy of just being in the Lord. As soon as you try to get your fulfillment from your calling, your vocation, you miss the point because it will all be forgotten. And in fact, Tim Keller says it even better in his book, Every Good Endeavor. He said, everyone will be forgotten. Nothing we do will ever make any difference. In all good endeavors, even the best will come to naught. Sounds just like living life backwards. Unless there's a God. If the God of the Bible exists, and there is a true reality beneath and behind this one, and this life is not only life, then every good endeavor, even the smallest ones, pursued in response to God's calling, can matter forever. Yet the paradox, like nothing matters and everything matters. It's this wonderful paradox about vocation that it's just really hard to wrestle with and to live in. So as I was studying for this and I was getting ready for this, I really want us to spend time with three ideas, and I would call them as called, created, and commanded. And I think we use the word called in a fairly broad sense to mean anything that we feel like we're led to do by God. And as I was studying for that, I think that's for this talk, I think that's a perfectly fine definition. But in the Bible, as I went to kind of research every single one, when there was a really call from God to an individual, it was absolutely clear. There was no doubt. The only question was whether the person was going to obey or not. This wasn't, well, I'm not sure if I'm called to this or not. It was, Moses, you're called. And you can come up with all the excuses, and I'm going to figure out every single one. The question is whether you're going to obey. Or Noah, or you go down the list in each specific one. And what I found quite interesting in all those too was that almost never was it a call to a vocation. Maybe Noah, building an ark. But it was almost always beyond the vocation. The many kept their vocation, and it was a calling beyond that. And so, if I was going to kind of summarize called, I think called is a wonderful word. I think it's a word that we should continue to use. But there's an aspect of called, like justification, that's really a God and you deal. And then there's vocation and a whole bunch of other things that are serving your neighbor. And that's why I put the cross there. I think if you think of this a little bit like what we were talking about with the Reformation. There's a relationship between you and God about being called, but then there's a vocational area where it's how you serve your neighbor. And I think for those, it's really quite important to think about created and commanded in some ways more than called. And the created and commanded is what I want to talk about very briefly, because I want to get into more of the meat of sales. But when you start reading in the Old Testament, and the New Testament too, but especially as I was reading the Old Testament, there are chapters and chapters and chapters where God talks about in Exodus 28 to 39, where it's talking about all the craftsmen and talks about those as gifts of the Spirit for them to be able to sew the garments together or do the particular work. I mean, we don't often think of those as gifts of the Spirit because we have a New Testament kind of language about gifts of the Spirit, but it's really interesting as you read those as also gifted, created to be able to do something in service to the Lord or to the neighbor. In 1 Corinthians 12, we know that there's a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit, and variety of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it's the same God who empowers them all. And to each is given a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. So it's this and this for the common good. So just as you think about that created, so like I said, how many of you have done something like, I don't know what you think of, like a personality profile of Myers-Briggs or something where you start to see your gifted area? Raise your hand. Talent. Yeah, everybody's done those. Almost everybody's done those. I personally don't like those, but I do them all the time. I can't help myself. It feels like you're putting yourself in a box, but they help reveal something that God has created you in a way. And so the last idea is commanded. And in some ways, I think this is probably the most important main point as I was reading through about called and vocation. And Colossians 3:17, whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And so much about that whole idea is that, again, like I have up there on the screen, it seems like this whole idea of called is more about the why and the how than the what we are doing. And I think that's so almost un-American, because we think about what we do is how we keep score and how we think about how much we make, and all of those are the rules of calling and vocation. And biblically, it seems to be just the opposite. It's the why and the how. So I want to then move into, for me, there are times where I have felt really called, and there are times where I wanted to do something and I was completely not called. One quick not called, when I graduated from high school, I was thinking about going into the ministry, and a wise counselor and my own review, it was very clear that having the gift of mercy is probably a good idea if you're going to go into the ministry, and so that kind of left me out at that point. Wasn't me, and it was so clear that God was closing that door, and I felt great about it. And there are places where, when I went to go from being in the financial world to work at a denomination, my wife and I prayed about it. It was we didn't want to move, we didn't want to do it, and yet we both came together and said, we're going. We just knew. It was just so obvious that we just knew. So I want to just then move to, can a sales role be a godly calling? And I want to do this in the yes but, yes and yes with, really quickly. Because I think this is, yes, a calling can be from God, and I don't think we would ever want to do that, but I would encourage us to make sure that it really is a clear calling from God. And so just be, the but there is, but really, really sort that out. So I actually do believe that most people that I know that are great at sales were created that way. And it's yes and really spend some time thinking about how those gifts could be used in a constructive way. And the commanded yes with, and we're going to get to this in a little bit, is I think people who are created and gifted at sales are also, as you face those conflicts of interest, it's a small step from being able to be a great influencer to a manipulator. And my observation of any gift you have, it's a small step to go from it being a gift to being a curse. And so I think if you're in that place where you're gifted, the command is to really manage that tension well and really work it. And I think the best way to do that is with somebody. So when I was a CEO, I want to move to the next thing is do we need salespeople anymore? How many think 5 years or 10 years from now, Amazon and all that will star ratings and social media will make sales irrelevant? Must have a lot of salespeople in the audience. No one raised their hand. I didn't buy that argument either, but I'll tell you it was always a question of not if but when. Technology will make it so easy for you to get the information and buy things. You won't even need somebody. The market will just work magically, and you won't need it. And the reality is that argument actually makes sense for some things, but my observation is that's not a very good argument for anything where you don't self-actualize. So, if I woke up today and I knew I needed cough drops, I went to Walgreens and got cough drops. I didn't need a salesperson to help me figure out cough drops. In fact, I know the brand I like. I know the ones that work for me. So, that wasn't needed. But there are times when there's something so complicated, so not what I'd normally wake up and think of. In the business I was in was how do you help people manage their finances? It's a really complicated business, and most people don't understand it and can make really bad choices. And in fact, helping guide somebody along that path is really critical. So my answer is this is going to change the way we think about sales, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but I believe sales is and will continue to be an honorable profession, but it's changing. And I think that's as we think of as Christians, how do we adapt to those changes and especially help with the godly guidance that's needed. So I want you to do just a quick experiment with your neighbor, and I'm going to give you some examples. And so I want you to talk about one experience that you've had where there was a great experience with a salesperson. They provided great wisdom, the service that you got really blessed you, etc. And then I want you to talk about a bad experience, one experience where you felt you got poor advice, and then I want you to talk about an ugly experience where you felt it was just dreadful. And so if you just turn to maybe one other person, we're not going to do this for long, but just take a minute, think of an experience. Doesn't have to be recent, could be yesterday, it could be a month ago, it could be 10 years ago, and just talk about that experience. So just introduce yourself, one of each. All right, we're gonna pull back together. How many found it easier to come up with the bad experience? Raise your hand. About half. How many found it easier to come up with the good experience? The other half. Bad or ugly, I guess we'll count those the same. And that's, and interestingly enough, that was in fact, in some ways, the bad experience came to my mind first, but the good experience, I had much more passion around And I came to appreciate, as you started thinking about the good experience, what it was about the good experience. And we actually did it at dinner tonight, and you know, it really is some of the joy that the salesperson has for what they're doing and how they're helping you. It comes through in that process. And so it's really interesting as you start thinking about what is the role of the salesperson. And so I want to give you a little model of, I'm on the board of a small technology company, actually just getting off the board, but it's one that works with ministries and businesses, and they do a lot of the technology behind Compassion International and Campus Crusade and other ministries, but they also do it for dentist's office and doctor's office and some financial planners. And they talk about the sales role, and the language they use is champions, is somebody who's going to be a champion for somebody else. And the idea of a champion is somebody who wants to help somebody accomplish what they want. So serving their neighbor is helping the other person and be their champion. And it took them a long time to sort out this model, but what they concluded is there's a process of marketing which was, you know, getting people to be interested in whatever the topic was. But then there was a sales process which they call connect, know, match, catalyze. And it was the process of connecting with somebody, whether it's, and like I said, for drug rehab, they do that, drug rehab. It's like, how do you get connected to a drug rehab center? There's a marketing program for that, but there's also a sales process with the family and the agency that's doing it. The know process is an interesting process because depending on the complexity of the product or service you're doing, getting to know the person is actually one of the most important things that you can do as a salesperson, because often the product or service needs to be customized. And in fact, one of the things in financial services, to give a really specific example, knowing the mistakes that they're going to make, the familiar mistakes, is really an important part of knowing the kind of things the kinds of products that you would want to put somebody in, because you can get them in a savings, but if they're going to blow it in 8 months and pay even more than that they would have paid otherwise, that's a bad choice. Even though it may be a lower cost option, it may actually in the long run be a higher cost option. And knowing the behavior behind that is really important. So there's a know process. And then there's a matching process where you say, okay, I've gotten to know you well enough, now I'm going to match you to what I think is the right process. Honestly, almost every one of my greatest sales experiences, and where I've actually gone back to salespeople repeatedly and I trust them implicitly, is when they match me to something that isn't in their company. I went in to get a paint. I'm actually selling my house and I needed some paint, and I went to the little paint store. I used to work in a paint store, so I know the business a little bit, and I told him what I was looking for, and he said, yeah, that's a really tough one. In fact, the other store down the road would actually help you with that. They'd really solve your problem better than what we could do here. I've shopped there ever since. You know, it's like the Christmas on 42nd Street or whatever, when when the Santa Claus is recommending the toys somewhere else. There's a matching process that's quite intuitive, that sometimes you can solve their problem and sometimes you can't. And then there's a catalyze, and catalyze is we were joking about it. People don't like pushy salespeople, right? And yet the reality is nothing happens unless you finalize the deal to some degree, for either person, for most things. And so how do you catalyze somebody's behavior in a constructive, positive way? I believe there's a Christian aspect to each one of these things that we can look at and think about. What does it mean to be a Christ follower and do those in one way? But it's also a place where technology is changing each one of those. And we don't have time tonight to go into the details around that. But I think as we start to think about the role of godly sales, the two that are probably most likely going to be computerized is the know and the match. We can get more and more. I mean, this is in essence what Amazon does. They get to know you and they match you. The part that the connect and the catalyze, especially for, again, those things that you don't naturally self-actualize for, I don't think that's actually something that is going to happen because a 5-star rating tells you to do it. I think it actually takes somebody with godly guidance to help you along that journey. So I want to give you one quick case study. A local company here, Key Hubs, we hired them when I was at Thrivent. We hired them to look at our sales practices. There's a case study that you can have, and I just want to give you this really quickly. It's a simple idea, and then you can read the case study. So we basically were looking at how could we help our salespeople both be wise, and what were the aspects of the people who were really high performers. And high performers were measured not just in sales volume, but helping the customer at the end get what they want. And so we looked at 2 regions, and we looked for role models that were the role models that were people who were not only the great high producers, but were doing the right thing. And the 2 models, the low and the high performing, didn't look that different. They kind of had a few role models, and they were sitting kind of in the middle of the sales. This is a network picture. That's what Key Hubs does, is they look at the influencers and how they modeled, and it looked like, wow, there's really almost no difference there. And so then we started to say, well, who were the influencers? Where did that role model sit as an influencer within that region? And here's the high performing and the low performing. Interestingly enough, the leadership of the high performing, this was a high performing region, put those role models, the people who are doing it the right way, the godly people, in the center of. They used that person to demonstrate success, more than just sales, but how that person was living. And the low performing didn't do that. In fact, they had a bunch of other high performing salespeople that were more at the center. And so we then started to model, well, what were the things about the people who were those role models? What did it look like? What were their characteristics? Interestingly enough, here was their secret sauce. They were generous, incredibly generous. They'd mentor other people without being asked, without expecting reward. They were solving other people's problems beyond their own. They were volunteering to help, both in their community and other people. And interestingly enough, the other people in the network described them as trustworthy in character first, not in competence. They weren't always the people who were the best technicians, but they always had the right character. And they were good technicians too. They were pretty good. They're good technicians, but they are great at character. Sounds like godly guidance to me. Generous character, and produced high-performing sales teams. Interesting, huh? So I want to end with conflicts of interest. Almost end. Conflicts of interest, and this is the biggest mistake I've made in my entire career, honestly, was not firing my top salesperson at a time when I knew it needed to be done. But she was producing so many great sales. It was just really hard to do that. And I was the new CEO of this company, and she was downright mean. But she also produced a lot of sales. And when I look at it, we set up so many of our sales systems to create a conflict that's not healthy. And so I think this is one of those things as we start to talk about godly sales and we talk about in the panel and other things, how do we as Christian business owners or salespeople manage these conflicts in a way that are healthy? And there's two things. If you think about rewards and relationships, I think the rewards piece is all about transparency. The more you can be transparent about the rewards and be really clear about that, I think the better off you can be with your customers, with everyone, and just be really transparent with that. I have a few stories, and I'm not going to tell you about that just because we're going to run out of time, but transparency and being honest about it is one of the ways I found that that you can really overcome to some degree those reward challenges. Every great salesperson that I've known has used that to build trust. The relationship piece, which I have seen consistently whenever I would talk to our top salespeople, they would always say, I'm not playing the short game, I'm playing the long game. And I think with the relationships, just like when you send somebody off to a different store to buy from somebody else, that's playing the long game. That's trusting that you're giving somebody great advice and that they will then come back to you. So I think this conflict is bigger than right now in society. In some ways, we make this conflict bigger than it really is. But I think as Christians, we need to be honest about this and wrestle with this. So I want to end with Colossians 3 and 4, just this little bit. And because as I was getting ready and I was reading this, and I used the kind of the more literal translation because I like the language of it. It's hard to read, but it's helpful, I think. And so I'm just going to read this. But every time it says bondservant, think salesperson, and every time it reads master, think sales leader. So it says, bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters. And I love this phrase, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart. Isn't that, can't you just tell when a salesperson is sincere and they're not just an eye pleaser? Isn't that a great line? Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for man, knowing that that from the Lord you will receive your inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Just forget about everybody else. Just do what's right. Now, masters, next one here. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. How do you think about that as a leader of salespeople? And then I love what Paul says as he concludes. Continue steadfast in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray for me that I may make it clear which is I ought to speak, walk in wisdom towards outsiders, and make the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. I think this is just such a wonderful little part of Scripture that's talking about how to show up in the world of commerce and sales in a way that, again, back to the more of the why and how instead of the what we do. So back to, I believe sales is just such a needed, in fact, in our world today as it gets more complex, is probably godly salespeople are needed more so than ever. And I just want to lift up those of us who are in sales or those of us who are thinking about going in sales to realize that this is part of how we serve our neighbor, oftentimes to help them on their path to a wise choice. So thank you very much.